I understand that the subject of the lecture is security. I prefer to discuss national security, namely to look beyond instruments that you use from time to time to preserve the security of the State of Israel in a narrow sense of the term, to understand the strategic situation of Israel. I'll be delighted later in the Q&A if anybody is interested in discussing specific security concerns, but I think we need to see an overall reality. And the most important one is that Israel lives in a hopeless area. I know that I'm using a very radical term, but unfortunately reality is radically bad, and therefore a radical term is appropriate. If you look at the Middle East, it's not only that we have a crisis today, and 500,000 people probably have died in Syria, nobody knows the exact number. It's not only that Iraq has crumbled, and Syria has crumbled, and Yemen, and Libya, and South Sudan, and the other countries are on the verge of crumbling. This is a problem that if that were the only problem, we could live with it and say, okay, in 2 years, in 5 years, in a decade, things will be different. Unfortunately, what is going on in the Middle East is only a product of 100 years of what Arabs have done, or to be more specific, have not done, namely no nation building for 100 years. Syria was hopeless before it erupted. Iraq was hopeless before it erupted. Nobody here was present, to the best of my knowledge, in my lectures here in this house 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I used to say, this is a situation that is catastrophic today, only it's not on the surface. We don't see it. And then it erupted, and now we see it. But it used to be this way for a very, very long time. And because there was no nation building, and because I don't see it even beginning now, I don't think that in 10 years or in 20 years, the situation in the Middle East will be better. Whatever happens in the Middle East, and actually it doesn't really matter who's in power in this or in that country in terms of its ability, of his ability or her ability, the ability of any leader in the Middle East, to bring the Arab states to a position where they can meet the challenges of the 21st century. Many of them have not met the challenges of the 20th century, and I doubt if they can, in the foreseeable future, do it. Now, what will happen in 200 years, I don't know. 2, 3 generations from now, things may be different. But if I look at the way children are being educated in the Arab world today, I don't think that this generation can be any better than the previous generation in terms of dealing with the fundamental problems of the Arab world. And this is perhaps the most important part of Israel's national security. Namely, when you live in a region that is as structurally unstable, violent, and hopeless as the Middle East is, living in peace in Israel is not an option. You can have a peace process if you have a very developed sense of humor and you want to speak about, Arab democracy, peace in the Middle East, things that sound well, and usually when things sound well, they're probably untrue. And if you want to deal with the realities of the Middle East, and it took the Israelis a very long time to realize this, you realize in Israel today when people are speaking about the possibility of a war, they don't say if a war will come. They say when the war comes, when the inevitable war comes. It can be 2 months, it can be 2 years, it can be 5 years even, you never know. When the next war comes, A, B, and C, and D will happen. And when you speak about national security, or even security in the narrower sense of the term, under these circumstances, what you actually mean, there is no solution. You do A, B, and C, and maybe it helps you to come through the next crisis. But whatever you do, creating a situation of peace in the Middle East is not an option. Let me put it in a very blunt way. If this is how Arabs treat each other, imagine how they would treat the Jews if they could. Arabs throughout the Middle East are engaged in killing each other. And I mean everybody killing everybody. I don't know that you have somebody in the Middle East who's trying to develop an open society and a democratic system, and then he has nasty neighbors, and he himself is nice. Shiites do it to Sunnis, Sunnis do it to Sunnis, Shiites do it to Shiites, Christians do it to Arabs, Arabs do it to Kurds, Kurds do it to Arabs. The whole region is based primarily on tribal societies. The structures that you see in the Middle East are not modern structures. When you speak about states in the Middle East and you use terminology like coalition, opposition, judiciary, legislative, and so on, these terms are irrelevant because these terms come from a structure. I think we can keep the door closed now. They come from a modern political and social structure. What you have in the Middle East is not modern political and social structures. Now, do you have exceptions here and there in the Middle East? Minor exceptions, yes. But if you look at the overall picture of the Middle East, what you see are tribal societies who are engaged in tribal wars, and the option that this will be pacified if only you do A, B, or C is ludicrous. Anybody who speaks about these terms has no idea what's going on in the Middle East. Let me give you only one example. The Secretary of State of the United States, John Kerry, a few years ago, 2 years ago, I believe, came to the Middle East and said, in 9 months, I'm going to bring Israeli-Palestinian peace. Again, he has a great sense of humor and no understanding whatsoever about anything in the Middle East. I can't imagine somebody more ignorant than this Secretary of State of the United States coming to the Middle East and saying, I just need to go there and I'll speak to people and I'll convince them that war is bad and peace is good, and then they'll sit around the table and they'll negotiate and they will come up with an agreement. That's not an option. It will not happen. And this is the bad news. The good news, from an Israeli point of view, we're having this discussion from an Israeli point of view because from an Arab point of view, I don't see the good news. But from an Israeli point of view, the good news is peace is very desirable, very important, and you can live without it. Is it better to have peace? Yes. Can you live without it? Yes. And to have a good life. I've lived in Israel long enough. I've been in 8 wars, and I live in Israel. I have a very good life. I enjoy my life. The overwhelming majority of Israelis have a good life. We can defend ourselves. We're strong enough to defend ourselves. We base our defense to a crucial extent on deterrence, namely on convincing the Arabs, the radical Arabs, that making war against Israel will cost them too much and they can't afford it. And usually it works, and sometimes it doesn't. And what is more important, and recently tremendously important, is you convince other Arabs that the best way to keep their vital interests is to work with Israel against the radicals. So if you look at the situation of Israel today, in terms of security, in the broad sense of the term, the picture is very good. When you look at it in a narrow sense, then it looks very bad, but you should always see these things in a broad context. And let me explain what I mean. When you look at it in a narrow sense, you say to yourself, well, things have gotten much worse recently. The Middle East is much more unstable, much more hopeless, much more violent. We're stuck in the middle of the Middle East, and violence from radical Arabs is much more likely than before. We have at least 2 elements in the Middle East. They're non-state actors or sub-state actors, but they're very heavily equipped, particularly Hezbollah, but also Hamas. And they will make war, because this is what they're about. They're about making war. They make war against each other. They slaughter Arabs much more than they slaughter Jews. And as far as they're concerned, their problem is not with something that Israel did, but their problem is that there are Jews. They openly say, we are for not only the destruction of Israel, but for killing of Jews. If you take, for instance, Hamas, and you take the covenant, the most important, the constitution of Hamas, it not only speaks about killing Jews because they're Jews, It also quotes very liberally from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and they give the reference. This comes from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, so they're also anti-Semitic. And they will make war because this is what they're about, because they're not interested in having a better life. And if somebody wants to question this statement, I'll be delighted later to give you a few demonstrations of it in the Q&A. They want to kill Jews. So they will try to kill Jews, and sometimes they'll succeed in killing Jews. So this looks very bad. But then you ask yourself what I consider to be the most important question. Not are things getting better? This is the dumb way of being an optimist. But do I become stronger faster than things are getting worse? Let me repeat this. This is not a simple concept. If things are getting worse, and they usually are, it's the Middle East, but I can become stronger faster than things are getting worse, then in terms of the gap between me and my enemies, I'm in a much better position. So Israel today is in a position where there is no conventional threat to the existence of the state of Israel. In other words, there is no Arab army actively engaged in confrontation with Israel that can threaten the existence of Israel. It's a new reality. For many decades, I would go to military service, and my job was to find out how to deal with huge expeditionary forces coming from Iraq, with a military attack coming from Egypt and Syria, while the Iraqis are joining and the Jordanians have no choice but to join, and Israel needs to fight with all of them, and it happened. These armies are no longer in existence. There is one large, relatively modern Arab army, the Egyptian army, but Egypt doesn't want to be at war with Israel, not because there is a peace treaty where they signed something, but because they realized Egypt will cease to exist if it is in war with Israel without even the Israelis doing anything, just economically. The Egyptians will starve if they will even try to make war against Israel. The Israelis don't need to do anything about it. The Egyptians understand it. So this army at the moment is not threatening Israel. And the other armies don't exist. An Iraqi army doesn't exist, the Syrian army doesn't exist, and the very little that exists of the Syrian army is slaughtering Syrian civilians. So we are in a relatively good situation where an existential threat to Israel doesn't exist. It's new. We have on the horizon the possibility of an Iranian threat to the existence of Israel through nuclear weapons. But we have a few years to prepare ourselves for that, and we know more or less what to do about it. So again, when it comes to existential issues, our situation is much better than ever before. When it comes to alliances in the region, and this is crucial, we have a very, very intimate relationship with Egypt. Let me put it to you this way. Until recently, the president of Egypt trusted two people, his mother and an Israeli general. Recently, his mother died. The only person that the president of Egypt is trusting today is Amos Gilad. And it's excellent. Would I love something much better, to have a democratic Egypt, enlightened and flourishing economically, in collaboration or in cooperation with Israel? Yes. But if you look at the realistic alternatives of Egypt being an active enemy or Egypt being very, 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 very close to Israel, that's not bad. Look at the Jordanians. The Jordanians, again, and Israel have not only good relations, they have intimate relations. So our longest border, we have a neighbor that we have excellent relations with. Our southern border with the largest army, we have a very good relationship with. On our northern border, our different enemies are killing each other. I mean, the Assad regime and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and every other hooligan throughout this area, they're basically engaged in killing each other. All the barbarians kill each other. Now, would I love to have a peace-loving Syria much better than this civil war? Yes. But is the present situation in the region, where Israel doesn't have any role Is it better than a strong Syria preparing for war with Israel as we had for decades? Yes, it is better. Again, bad, but much better than before. And if you look at what is happening in Israel, Israel is flourishing from every possible point of view, not just militarily being very strong and economically being very strong, but I should be very careful saying this in Europe, because here is where Israel is very strong and Europe isn't so very strong. We have 3 children per family. If you ask me, the number one threat to Europe is 1.3 children per family. This is by far the greatest threat to Europe. And if you add to it massive Arab immigration into Europe, then Europe has problems. You know, in the last few years, there were a lot of articles throughout Europe and also in Britain, does Israel have a future? I think that we should write a few articles about does Europe have a future? And if I were to choose between being in Israel and being in Europe, being in Israel is much, much better. Because what you have is not just many children, but also Israelis who are happy about their life in Israel. Because what is important is not just the objective question, does Israel offer a good life, but what do the Israelis think about it? Now, here is something that is very difficult to understand for people who are not Israelis. Israelis will complain. You stop complaining, your Israeli citizenship is revoked. Okay? Complaining is what we are about. But after you've finished complaining, there is something, by the way, it's not just Israelis. Jews have a genetic defect. A Jew cannot feel good unless he feels bad. When he feels bad, he's relaxed, you know, it's okay, things are bad. But you ask the same people 2 questions in the largest public opinion poll in Israel, 34,000 people. All the other public opinion polls in Israel have 508 people representing all the population. There is one huge one that the Central Bureau of Statistics holds every year, 34,000 people sample. And they ask them 2 questions. What do you think of Israel? And the answer is, it's terrible. Nothing works. Everybody is an idiot. I'm much better than anybody else, being in Israel. And then you ask, how is your life? And they say, great. I'm happy. And my life has never been as good as it is now, and next year it will be better. Okay? When it comes to the index of happiness, you have an international public opinion poll on the subject. There are 6 or 7 of them. Our lowest rate is the 11th from the top. Our best is the 2nd from the top. And the people on the top really don't know what they answer. They're in Finland or something. I mean, people who live in real places, not in Scandinavia. Our situation is much, much better subjectively as people feel about themselves than Britain and France and Germany and the United States. You take the countries we constantly measure ourselves up against. It is very difficult to understand it because if you read Haaretz, you have a view of Israel that is the extreme opposite of what Israel is. Israel is the extreme opposite of what Haaretz writes about Israel. And Haaretz is the only thing that European diplomats write. A European diplomat in Israel gets up in the morning, reads Haaretz, translates it into his respective language and sends it home, and then people here read it and say, oh, what is happening in Israel is terrible, and so on. Okay, so why are not Israelis leaving? And again, the Israeli journalists lie about the number of Israelis leaving. You have international yardsticks on it, and we are the 2nd lowest among the OECD countries. If you read Haaretz, all the Israelis have migrated to Berlin. I was just there 3 weeks ago. You'll be surprised, they still speak German in Berlin. I tried to speak Hebrew, and it was quite difficult. Okay? So more people per capita leave Germany than people per capita leave Israel. But the journalists will lie about it every day. But the numbers are very, very clear. You can't falsify the numbers. It's very easy. And by the way, it's very easy to leave Israel. Most of us, millions if I'm not mistaken, have European passports or American passports. Okay, we speak the languages. We're very talented people. We fool people into believing that we can be very helpful, we're very desired throughout the world, we're very innovative, so it's very easy to leave. But Israelis don't leave. They complain, but they don't leave. So you have a reality where, again, I'm sorry you're Europeans not to make your day, but in Israel you have a lower rate of unemployment than in Europe, a higher rate of growth than in Europe. Israel is the only country in the world that is both democratic and has a real compulsory military service. Okay? Sometimes they get people into an army and they serve there for 6 months and they learn how to salute. In Israel, you can be in the army like me for many, many years. I've never learned to salute. I don't think Israelis know how to salute, and that's exactly what an army should be like. But you have people who, when they become 18, go into the army, unless they're ultra-Orthodox or Arabs. Ultra-Orthodox or Arabs may volunteer if they want to come to the army, but they're not conscripted into the army. We have a country with military conscription that is a democratic country with military conscription. There is one such country in the world. And it works. The majority of Israelis like to go to the army. Not only because when they go to their reserve service, they can see to it that their wife doesn't see them for 2 weeks or for 2 months. That's one of the reasons, but not the only reason, that people will go and serve in the military service. So you have a situation in Israel that is not easy, but if you can live with 80% Jews, then nothing else is a real challenge. I mean, usually people live with 2% Jews, this is bearable. 80% Jews is much more difficult, and once Israelis manage to do that, the rest is relatively easy. Basically, and let me perhaps conclude here my opening remarks, and I'll be delighted to go into any subject you're interested in later. Basically, the situation of Israel is that we have huge problems and measures that are very effective in dealing with these problems. Let me put it this way. If Europe had effective measures against Russian aggression, I think that are on the same level that we have against Arab aggression, Europe would be in good shape. So we have problems, but we have answers. I would not say we have solutions, because to use the term solution and Middle East in the same sentence is, from a syntax point of view, impossible. Peace, solution, understanding, and Middle East should not belong in the same sentence. So I'm not speaking about solutions. I'm speaking about an acceptable, reasonable answer. We have reasonable answers to our very serious problems compared to Europe that doesn't have it on most issues. I'm sorry to say, but we can disagree. It will be fun. I enjoy disagreeing with people. But the most important thing is, even if I'm wrong, and once I thought I was wrong, but I was mistaken. So even if I'm wrong, the important thing is that Israelis think they have it. And when you think you have a way of dealing with your problem, this produces national resilience. And when you have a nation that only 2 years ago we were at war with Hamas, and 70% of our population was sitting in air raid shelters because our cities and our towns were bombarded by missiles. And then 5 minutes afterwards, we shook off the dust from our sleeves and we went on it as if it never happened. This is national resilience. Israelis who've lived through a very long period of time where people are trying to kill them, and they know that the next war is coming, but they like their life. They basically look at the reality in the Middle East, and this is my last comment here, more or less like Americans look at earthquakes and mudslides and tornadoes. You see, people who live in California live on the San Andreas fault. There's always been earthquakes, and there will be earthquakes in the future. In Oklahoma, every year you have a major part of the city ripped apart by twisters, by tornadoes. And people live there. And we have radical Arabs it's another kind of natural disaster, and it comes and it goes, and you learn to live with it, and you have a good life. And then people write that very soon you're going to crumble. Fine. They only write it, it doesn't matter. And our national security is in good shape, even if our security in the narrow sense of the term is very seriously and permanently challenged. Let me stop here and